Welcome to this next video in a series of videos from Boat Companion. Right, we're going to go pretty quickly here because there's a lot to get through, and I would strongly advise that you read up on all of these different types of safety equipment to put your own perspective on it. But this just raises all of the equipment that is available out there and the recommended equipment on different types of boat. Now, the most important thing is a life jacket. Every single person on the boat should have a life jacket. In my opinion, they should be worn at all times, and there's many different types out there. Have a look what's on the market, but make sure you get a decent one with a crotch strap and possibly a spray hood, and an auto-inflation is also a very good way to go. The next thing is a life ring, a great thing to throw out to somebody if they've fallen into the water. A life ring should have a light attached to it. The light sits in the water with the life ring that the person's holding on to, so that a rescuer can find the person if they're in the water at night time. Next thing, bilge pump. Very important to have a bilge pump in case water makes its way into the boat. You can use the bilge pump to pump that water out. Very, very important piece of equipment. And not only do you have the fixed handheld, but the fixed bilge pump that's shown in this picture, it's also a very good idea to have a handheld bilge pump, as shown in this picture. Now, the great advantage of a handheld bilge pump is it allows you to get into areas that you wouldn't be able to get into with the fixed bilge pump that's fixed into the boat with the pipes distributed around the boat. Very useful piece of equipment, and the handheld bilge pump is actually very cheap and a worthwhile piece of kit. Next thing is a throw line, a floating throw line. So if somebody does fall overboard, you can use this throw line to throw a rescue line out to the person so they can grab onto that line and you can pull them back into the boat. Essential to have this on all boats. Now, the next thing is a radar reflector. If you're stuck out in fog and say you're in a shipping channel, it's a very good idea to have a radio reflector on board, so that radar reflector on board, so that you can hoist that to the top of your mast or the highest point on the boat. Reflects radar from larger boats so that they can see where you are. Fire extinguisher, incredibly important. The thing that kills the most people at sea is fire, and therefore it's very important to hold a fire extinguisher on board. It's a good idea to get a powder extinguisher, which is useful for many different fires, including hydrocarbon fires that you may find in your fuel systems on board a boat. If you have cooking on board, it's a good idea to have a fire blanket to douse any fires that may occur whilst cooking on board, especially if you're using fats. It can also be used to smother out smaller fires on the boat. Now, if you have an engine compartment on the boat, so if you have a relatively larger power boat, then you can have fixed extinguishing systems. What we have here is something called fire trace, where a pipework is run around the enclosure of the engine room, and this the pipework actually explodes and releases the fire suppressant directly onto the fire. Important to have a smoke alarm if you're in the boat at night time and you're asleep. It's important to be able to note there's a fire very quickly. It's also a good idea to have a gas alarm. The gas alarm will alert you to a gas leak on the boat. An essential piece of kit on any boat is an anchor. The anchor can be used if the engine fails and you're in water shallow enough to be able to drop anchor. Stops you from drifting around and even onto rocks or the shoreline where you don't want to be. It's also a very good idea to carry a spare anchor just in case you lose your main anchor if it gets stuck in the seabed and you have to leave it behind. Never set sail without an anchor. First aid kit, obviously very important to have a first aid kit. When you're out at sea, you don't have anybody else apart from the people on board the boat to help with any medical situation. So a first aid kit well kitted out is a very important thing to have on board. The next thing here are wooden bungs. If you have a collision with something, or for instance a fitting that goes through the hull of the boat comes out, then it's a good idea to have cork bungs on board so that you can push those cork bungs into the hole to stop any ingress of water. Now, a foghorn is a very important thing to have on all boats. If you're out and you get stuck in fog, it can happen very, very quickly. It can happen without warning. It's important that you have a foghorn on board to warn other people of your location water. Now the next thing we're looking at here is a handheld VHF radio. Important to have a handheld VHF radio. It's not absolutely essential if you have a fixed radio, but some boats decide to have a handheld radio only and not have the fixed radio. So you do need a VHF radio if you're going any kind of distance offshore and out into the sea. If you're on a larger boat, it's a good idea to have a fixed radio, highly recommended. This particular radio has something called DSC, Digital Selective Calling. You can press the button and it will automatically send your location to the Coast Guard and will automatically summon help. Very useful, essential piece of equipment. Good idea to have a light on board, a torch. If you lose your electrics for some reason, water ingress into the boat for instance, and it's night time, you need to be able to find where the safety equipment is, where that leak's coming from. So if your electrics fail, to have a torch on board will be something extremely valuable. Next thing, we'll move on to navigation equipment. What we've got here is a handheld compass. There will be a fixed compass on board, but the fixed compass will not allow you to take bearings of things that are on the shoreline, for instance, or buoys or lights, which can then give you a position fix on where you might be if you lose your GPS, for instance. Binoculars, extremely important for seeing where other boats are and for seeing what lights are out there, and for generally working out your location, and also during the day to check where you're going. Sometimes it's incredibly hard to actually see the port, for instance, that you're heading for. So binoculars are good to give you an early warning. Obviously, you need your charts, you need your plotter, you need all of your navigation, your manual navigation equipment on board. Never just rely on GPS. Although GPS is extremely valuable, it's a good idea. Well, it's essential to have the paper charts and all of the equipment around. GPS extremely useful. I personally navigate using GPS most of the time. I think it's a fantastic invention, something that everybody should have on board. I know others think differently, but don't ever just rely on your GPS. Have other methods of being able to find out where you are, such as the paper charts. Batteries. Don't just have the one battery. If you have a single battery and everything is fed off of that battery, and all your electronics, for instance, and you're out sailing for a long time, you haven't run your engine for a while, you can actually run out your battery, and then you're left in a situation where you cannot restart the engine. Not a situation that you want to be in. Toolkit. Absolutely essential to have a toolkit that allows you to do all the jobs that you need to do on board. Again, if you're out there by yourself, nobody else can come and help you. The only person that can help are the people that are on the boat. Having the right toolkit is essential with all of the correct tools. And on the same line, you also should have spares. Spares are all of the main things that could go wrong. This may be a water pump for your engine, or it could be a fan belt for the engine, or a drive belt for the engine, cam belt. All these things very, very important to ensure that you can replace these things if things go wrong. And the absolutely essential £1 cost from B&Q is the bucket. Many other shops do buckets also. And it's very important to have this on board because it's invaluable if you start taking in a lot of water and can actually pump more water out than a bilge pump. So very useful piece of equipment. Boarding ladder is very important that you have a method for getting people back onto the boat. It's incredibly difficult to pull people back onto a boat, especially over guardrails. Best way to get people back on a boat is for them to climb up the ladder by themselves. There are other ways of getting people back on board. Now, many would say they're not absolutely essential, but if your budget can stretch to it, it's a good idea to have all these other person recovery systems available. Flares, very important. It's a whole subject in itself, so I won't go into details, but different flare packs are appropriate for different distances that you're offshore, and flares are still one of the most important items to have on board to be able to show the lifeguards, the Coast Guard, whereabouts you are. Navigation lights. You should have a full set of navigation lights. Even if you don't plan on sailing at night, it's a very good idea to have the navigation lights available in case you get stuck out there at night time. Very good for avoiding collisions with other boats. Next thing is you should have spare fuel and spare water available so that if you're in a situation where you have to be out for longer than you thought you were going to be out, or for instance your engine conk's out, you've got water available. Always carry spare water and spare fuel on board. The next thing is a life raft. Now, a life raft is not essential on every single boat, but according to the distance that you're going to go offshore, look into life rafts, look into whether you think you need a life raft according to where you're going to be. There are lots of different life rafts out there. Make sure it's the one big enough to take all the people that are on the boat, and make sure it's kitted out to the appropriate specification for what you're going to use it for. Grab bag. It's a good idea to keep all of your safety equipment and all that safety equipment that we're talking about today, or as much of it as possible, in a grab bag. Not only does it keep it in one place, but it also means that if you have to evacuate the boat into the water or into a life raft, you have all that essential equipment such as your GPS, your handheld radio, and all those things with you. Very important to have additional ropes and warps on board, especially if you need to be towed by somebody else, or if lines break, or if you need to mend things. Always a good idea to have spare lines on board a boat. And the next thing that we're looking at here is a harness. Now those items that we've discussed so far are the essential items for any boat. The next few items are more for sailing yachts. So a harness, if it gets to a situation where it's incredibly rough and people are being thrown around the cockpit, good idea to have a harness and connect onto a part of the boat so you're not thrown overboard. Now, a knife is a good idea for everybody. It's especially important on a sailing yacht in case somebody gets caught in a rope, in case somebody's hair gets caught in a rope, someone's finger gets caught in a rope. It's very important to be able to cut ropes to release people in emergency situations. Another item essential for sailing yachts are bolt croppers. If you're dismasted, so if your mast breaks off of the boat, it will still be attached to the boat by all of the rigging. The rigging will be steel, and it's incredibly difficult to release that rigging unless you have a method for cutting the rigging away. So bolt croppers are very important on any sailing yacht. Bosun's chair, often not seen as being a piece of safety equipment, but if you're out a long distance offshore and you haven't necessarily got enough fuel to get back and you have to sail home, then a bosun's chair can be an absolutely essential piece of kit for mending anything which may have been damaged or broken up the mast. Now, shapes indicate whether you're underway, whether you are at anchor. It's something that the Coast Guard insists that you show. Probably not used as much as they used to be used, but still a requirement to show shapes to indicate during the day what your particular situation is, so you must keep them on board. GPS, a secondary GPS, a handheld GPS. As I say, I rely quite heavily on GPS more than some would, but one way of ensuring that you're never going to be without GPS is to hold a second GPS, and also great for going in your grab bag if you end up overboard or if you end up in the life raft. Another great way to communicate with people where you are. A drogue. Now, a drogue is something which is very useful if you're going a long distance offshore and you are in deep water where you can't drop an anchor. A drogue will stop you from drifting. You drop it into the water. It's like a large kite that sets itself in the water. It also can keep the front of the boat pointed towards the waves and into the wind, which is extremely useful for keeping a comfortable position in the water in heavy seas. The next thing you're seeing here is a dam buoy. A dam buoy sits in the water, sticks up with a flag on the end of it, probably about 6 to 8 feet off the surface of the water, makes it a lot easier for people to find you. What we have here is an EPIRB, a emergency position indicating radio beacon. Highly useful if you're offshore, if you're going long distances. It will automatically send a signal to the Coast Guard with your GPS position. It will do this over satellite and over radio frequencies. A very good way for people to find you, especially if you're long distances away from the shore. Spotlight, if somebody goes overboard at night, your torch may not be appropriate or strong enough to find people. A 1 million, 2 million or even 5 million candle spotlight is very, very useful for finding where people are in the water. And what we have here is a emergency antenna. So if your main antenna at the top of the mast is lost, it may be that you've lost the whole mast. You can have an emergency VHF antenna that you can plug into your radio to allow you to continue communicating. So thank you very much, and that's all we have for today, and I hope you'll join us next week for the next video in the Boat Companion series.